Welcome to the Kinder Institute Forum. I'm Bill Fulton, the director of the Kinder Institute, and we have with us today Donald Shoup, distinguished research professor of urban planning at UCLA. The Kinder Institute Forum series brings thought leaders from around the country and the world to Houston to share ideas about today's most pressing urban issues. We asked if you're live tweeting today, we ask you tweet using hashtag KI Forum. That's hashtag KI Forum. And you can follow us on Twitter at @RiceKinderInst, @RiceKinderInst. When we get to the Q&A portion of this, the way this is going to work today is Don's not going to give a presentation. Don and I, who had known each other for a long time, are going to have a conversation where his wisdom will emerge. We will move on to questions and answers. If you have a question, please don't put it in the chat down at the bottom. Put it in the Q&A, because that way other people can see your questions, they can like them or vote for them, and they'll move up the list, and that'll increase the likelihood of us getting to them. The Kinder Institute Forum is made possible thanks to our friends at PNC Bank, the title sponsor of the lecture series, and we're lucky to have Julie Soto, the regional president of PNC Bank here in Houston, with us today. And I'd like to turn it over to Julie to make a few remarks. Julie, thank you to PNC for all of your support of the Kinder Institute.
Thank you, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Youngsutter, the regional president for PNC, as Bill mentioned. As a native Houstonian and Rice alum, it's a privilege to welcome you today as we learn more about what we can do as a community to improve the Houston metro area. As you all may know, PNC recently became the 4th largest bank in Houston, but our strategies remain unchanged. We are a Main Street bank, and as such, we're deeply committed to investing in this region's future. We do this in a variety of ways, but one of those is through supporting amazing community partners like the Kinder Institute. Their work is critical to the success of our community and has far-reaching implications. So it's an honor for PNC to support what you guys do at the Kinder Institute. I have no doubt that this will be an informative and thought-provoking conversation today, especially considering the distinguished speaker, Donald Shoup, professor of urban planning at the University of California, and the preeminent guru, I'm told, of parking policy. Spending more than 40 years researching the wide range of consequences of urban parking, his book, The High Cost of Free Parking, recommended reforms that have since been implemented by multiple cities across the country, yielding solidly successful outcomes. I'm personally eager to hear more insights from Professor Shoup, as I'm sure you are as well. And so with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to Bill Fulton to begin the program.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks again to PNC for your support. In addition to PNC, the title sponsor, generous support for these programs for the Kinder Institute comes from a multi-year grant from Houston Endowment. In addition, the Institute relies on philanthropic investments from other contributors. Special thanks go to Nancy and Rich Kinder and the Kinder Foundation, Laura and Tom Bacon, the Baxter Trust, the Hewlett Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the William T. Grant Foundation, Chevron, the JP Morgan Chase Foundation, Wells Fargo, Willie Nanakara and Associates, the Cullen Foundation, Raynette and Stan Merrick, the Spencer Foundation, Claire and Eric Anya, Arnold Ventures, Catherine and Hank Coleman, Sis and Hasty Johnson, Becky and Ralph O'Connor, Bank of America, Bracewell, HEB, and United Way of Greater Houston. I'd now like to introduce and welcome to our conversation Donald Shoup. If you could unmute yourself and show us your video, Don. Don Shoup is the distinguished research professor in the Department of Urban Planning at UCLA. His research has focused on parking, transportation, public finance, and land economics. He is the author of 2 books, which are classics in the field of parking, The High Cost of Free Parking and Parking and the City. He is the recipient of the American Planning Association's National Excellence Award for a Planning Pioneer and the American Collegiate Schools of Planning Distinguished Educator Award. Don, welcome to the Kinder Institute Forum. I forgot to mention, Don bears one more burden, which is that he had me as a student a long time ago. So thanks very much for being with us today, Don. We're going to mix it up today a little bit and have a a little bit of a different discussion, a different kind of format. Instead of making a presentation, Don and I will have a conversation. We'll talk about parking and the economics of parking, and then we'll turn it over to you for your questions. Don, well, thanks again for being with us today from Los Angeles. We appreciate your being here. You know, one of the things that I think, so you were trained as an economist. You did a wide range of research on a wide variety of topics, as we pointed out, such as public finance and so forth. And I can remember the first day I walked into your class in planning school at UCLA, and you started talking about people cruising for parking in Westwood, which is where UCLA is located. And I was a bit perplexed. I said to myself, what does this have to do with economics? And obviously, over the course of the quarter of the course, it became clear to me that it has a lot to do with economics. I'm just wondering how you, as an economist, got so fascinated by parking and decided to devote your distinguished career mostly to this one topic.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's certainly wonderful when a former student invites you back to speak. It's produces an old professor, what the hippies used to call a natural high. I'm delighted to speak to Bill and to everybody in Houston who's logged in. I think, like almost everybody in the parking profession, I backed into parking.
So to speak.
That nobody intends to go into the parking industry. But it's a big industry in every city. Parking is the single biggest land use in every city, and it affects everything, including development, all the city's transportation, and how we live. So I thought that it was an important thing, and I think the reason that I got into it is because it's so easy. That universities say that they're very dedicated to equity and inclusion and equality, but universities are extremely hierarchical. They have chancellors and vice chancellors and provosts and deans and full professors and assistant professors and graduate students and undergraduates and seniors and juniors. Everything is graded in university by rank. And your parking depends on your rank, so that UCLA has 197 different parking grades based on rank. It has been, and it isn't just the rank for your title, but also the topics that we study. The national affairs and international affairs are the most important. And state affairs are way down from that, and then local government is parochial. And what's the lowest class that you could study in local government? Well, that would be parking and sewage, I suppose. So I was a bottom feeder for most of these years. But there was a lot of food at the bottom, and nobody else was paying any attention. So I think that's why I gravitated into it, because there was lots to discover and nobody else was paying any attention to it. So it isn't that I've done a great job, it's that nobody else was doing work at all. So, but now there's almost a feeding frenzy on parking that a lot of academics are looking at it. I think more people are beginning to realize that I was right about some things. I think cities have made epic mistakes in their parking policies. I recommend essentially that cities should do exactly the opposite of what they're now doing. I think that most of our current parking policies are very damaging, and I think some cities are picking up on this.
We have a lot of people. We have over 300 people on the call right now. For those of whom, many of whom have read The High Cost of Free Parking, your classic book, or have heard you speak. But for those who haven't, when you say that cities should do the opposite of what they're doing in parking. What is it? Could you briefly describe your basic philosophy? What do cities do wrong, and what should they do instead? Just to level the playing field here for everybody.
Well, for those who are already Shoupistas, I three basic parking reforms, which are the opposite of what cities do. First, most curb parking is free in most cities, no matter how valuable the land. Even in New York, 97% of the curb parking spaces are free to anybody who can find this space. And that's probably true in Houston as well. And I recommend charging the right prices for curb parking, which is sort of a tautology. Who could object to the right prices? Although many drivers would even object to paying the right prices. But I think the right price for curb parking is the lowest price the city can charge and still have 1 or 2 open spaces on every block. So there will always be a curb space waiting for you when you arrive. And that's the lowest price the city can charge. So charging for curb parking is one of the things that is opposite of what cities are doing. And second is that most cities put the little meter revenue they get from their curb parking spaces into the general fund, which has no political, creates no political support for charging for curb parking. The money seems to disappear. Paying for parking is a pain, and there's no gain. So I suggest putting the meter revenue into paying for public services in the metered neighborhoods. And if your street has parking meters, you get the revenue in terms of cleaner sidewalks and safer sidewalks. And some cities give free Wi-Fi to everybody on the street. So the residents, people can see the benefits. So they realize if they don't have the meters, they don't get the benefits. And if they do have the meters, they do get the benefits. So it's, it's sort of a pragmatism that would make Machiavelli blush, that the idea you have to appeal to people's self-interest. I think economists are used to appealing to people's self-interest. So I think that it'll create an interest in charging for parking because it will improve your neighborhood. And then the third thing, most cities have off-street parking requirements. Because they charge nothing for curb parking, they have to require a lot of off-street parking. And I think this ought to end. I said in Houston, I looked it up this morning, Houston requires 1.333 parking spaces per apartment in an apartment building. The city planners really go down to 3 decimal points. How many parking spaces are needed for every apartment? No, they learn nothing about parking in their planning courses because the professors have nothing to teach. And the planning students find that parking requirements get in the way of everything they want to do. If they want to develop affordable housing or sustainable transportation or anything like that, parking requirements invite people to drive. And Houston requires 14 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet for a bar, which means the parking space is 5 times bigger than the bar. I mean, you certainly wouldn't want anybody to get to a bar without driving a car, would you? So I think that there are a lot of obvious inconsistencies between what we require for parking and what we want for everything else. We want clean air. We want permeable surfaces. We want fewer traffic accidents and fatalities. Just about every goal the city has is opposed by the city's parking policies. And I think that Houston has experimented with these new ideas. And actually, Texas is at the forefront of many of these reforms. Maria Ershad is the city's planning director. She's been a leader.
Parking director.
That's right. She manages parking for the city, and she's a leader in parking in the state of Texas. And Texas is really interested in this. Surprisingly, I'm part of cars in Dallas and Austin next week. So I'd say that maybe it's because Texas has no income tax and it has low property taxes and low sales taxes. So user charges are the way to go.
Yeah.
So unless the state prohibits you from charging for parking, I think that it's a good way. It's a good way to raise revenue, especially because the revenue sticks to where it arises. So, and I think these ideas are spreading around the world. The high cost of free parking has been translated into Russian and Romanian and Persian and Chinese. They all seem to be communist or ex-communist countries, that authoritarian countries. And maybe they've learned that it's a bad idea for the government to tell everybody what to do and to try to make everything free. So I think the ideas are spreading because many people, once they've been exposed to it, say, well, I'd like to have a parking benefit district in downtown or in my commercial district. They're very good in business districts. So that it's not a tax that any business pays. It's paid for by visitors. That is like Monty Python's idea of solving Britain's economic problem by taxing foreigners living abroad. So I think if you charge for current,
it's a little bit like that.
That's right.
A welcome stranger tax.
Exactly. California is very good at the welcome stranger policy,
Yes.
But I suppose Texas. Well, no, Texas is much more open than California, and I think.
Yes.
And
yes.
Texas has these market-based parking. They moved. They don't have any parking requirements downtown, and they're spreading the area, so it'll creep in on little cap feet.
I just want to point out, and I know you know this, Don, that Houston, the city of Houston, which of course has no use zoning, also has no parking requirement in the downtown. And that has recently been extended to Midtown Houston, where I live. And a while ago, I was talking to one of the landowners on the adjacent to downtown who built a restaurant and said that within this no parking requirement zone, and he said that if he had built it on the next adjacent parcel, which was over the line for the parking requirement, he would have had to build a parking garage. But because he built it one parcel to the north or whatever, he basically did not have to provide much parking at all. I was saying before we got on that I'm on the board of the Midtown Management District here in Houston, and we were just having a meeting today, and everybody's trying to wrap up the meeting as quickly as possible so they could come and hear Don talk. And in fact, here in Midtown, the city is about to put a parking benefit district in place of the type that you describe, and the management district and a committee that includes the management district will control the funds. I'm wondering, and questions are beginning to come in on this as well. Tell us a little bit about what you see as successful. What are good examples of successful parking reforms based on your ideas that you've seen? What are the best ones you've seen around the country?
Well, I think the poster child is the city of Pasadena, of Los Angeles. That was a commercial skid row when I was younger. It had wonderful buildings in terrible condition. This is the problem with many old downtowns, that they have things that are irreplaceable, these wonderful buildings, but the area has become like in Pasadena, a commercial skid row. People thought it would never revive, but when Rick Cole was mayor of Pasadena, then he's now the executive director of the Congress for New Urbanism. And when he was mayor, they wanted to put in parking meters in old Pasadena because it had been built in the earliest 20th century, but it was one of the most prominent shopping districts on the West Coast. It was a wonderful place, but it didn't have much parking because it was built so early, and it did decline. And finally, they thought, well, maybe we should put in parking meters because there was just the curb parking, and the merchants and the landlord said, "Wow, no way! That'll just drive away the few customers we have." And they argued for 2 years. And finally, the Rick Cole said, "Well, if we put in the parking meters, you'll get all the revenue to pay for the public services you want." They had a vision of what they wanted to be. They had a plan. They wanted to rebuild all of the sidewalks, which were in terrible condition, and fix up all the alleys, which were full of dead animals and mattresses and things like that. They wanted historic street lights and things like that, but they had no way to pay for it. And Rick Cole said, if we put in parking meters, we'll use all the money to provide all of these things that you want. And you can borrow money against parking meter revenue. So they borrowed $5 million, and they tore out all the sidewalks and replaced them with beautiful new sidewalks, with new street trees and cast iron gates around the grates around the trees, historic street lights. And they cleaned up the alleys, and they put the wires underground, and they put cobblestones in the alleys, and all paid for by parking meter revenue. Within 3 years, the sales tax revenue in the area increased 5 times. You know, that's the measure of commercial activity. Most of the buildings had been vacant above the ground floor, or even vacant totally. But the property owners, when they saw all the wonderful public improvements, they came through with historic preservation, which is, of course, an expensive proposition. And it didn't pay previously. Who would want to have a beautifully restored historic building if the sidewalks were in terrible shape in front and the alleys was filthy? So what the city did, what only the city can do, which is improve all the public services, then the property owners came through, like this guy who built a restaurant right near your house, and the property taxes, of course, went up, the sales taxes went up. All the city did was give them the parking meter revenue, which is a drop in the bucket compared to the city's budget. It is the ocean for the neighborhood, but it's a drop in the bucket for the city. And I think if the city gives this, doesn't give it, it lets the area keep it, then it created this terrific upward spiral that as the buildings were restored, there were more customers. It used to be that people used to drive from all around Southern California to walk around to Westwood when you were.
When I was a student, when I was your student, that is true.
And now people
now they all go to Pasadena.
That's right. Everybody drives to Pasadena. There's a very diverse group. Is that on an average weekend, 35,000 people walk around on the streets.
Wow.
A totally diverse group of people, every age and ethnicity and gender, sexual preferences, anything. Everybody loves Old Pasadena. So that's the long answer to your question of where does it work. And the second one, to give you some credit, was Ventura, California, when Bill Fulton was mayor of Ventura. And Ventura had sort of 50-year political shock resulting from their first attempt to put in parking meters in the 1950s. But I think the whole city council was recalled after that, and they tore out the parking meters. So everybody was afraid to parking meters, but Bill Fulton, our consultant, Patrick Sigmund from Nelson Nygaard, to come in and make a recommendation, and they recommend parking benefit districts and meters with the right prices. Bill invited me up to speak in the wonderful city hall in Ventura. I've never been to Ventura before. You drive through it, but it never occurred to me to stop there. But old Pasadena, it had a beautiful old main street that had fallen on hard times, and it went very well. I think my presentation, I stayed there. We stayed in a hotel for 3 or 4 days afterwards, went to about every restaurant in the city. And every time I came to a restaurant, the head waiter or the manager would come over and say, "Oh, I really like your talk, Professor Shoup." And I said, "Well, what do you like? What do you like about these ideas that will be less pollution and less traffic congestion?" And they looked at me as though I was the dumbest person on earth. And they said, "No, we want the money. The things on the street." They included giving free Wi-Fi to everybody, to all the businesses on the street. Free Wi-Fi paid by the parking meters. Now, I think if free Wi-Fi gets associated in people's minds with parking meters, they'll spread around the world, especially in low-income countries where the Wi-Fi is expensive and most people don't own a car, and yet they're so densely populated. The rich people's cars, cover the sidewalks everywhere. So I think that Ventura is another example of how it worked out well, including one thing I hadn't expected, nobody predicted, that they did surveys afterwards of 95% of the merchants liked it. There were a couple of merchants, I think a big knife seller didn't like it.
Yes, there was
Knife.
There was a guy who owned a flag and knife store, who was also the head of the local Tea Party chapter. He was the main opponent. And he gave up his store and created a mobile knife sharpening service out of his truck.
Well, that is a much better profession, I think. In the old days, most cities had people who would come around and sharpen your knives. That it, like delivering milk is something that disappeared. But one of the surprising things was that the crime rate fell by 50% in that area, the reported crimes, because they hired police cadets to sort of ambassadors to manage the park, to show people how to pay at these upscale, not parking meters, but parking stations where you can pay by credit card. And people had, and Ventura hadn't seen this before, so these people parading around costumed as police officers and paid by the parking meters, that reduced crime, made people feel safer, and they were safer. So I think, to answer your question, I think Pasadena and Ventura are two good examples, but there are others. I think El Paso is a good one. And San Marcos and Austin has them, and of course Houston has them. I think El Paso has a very active nightlife, and when they began offering the communities the option to have meters and meter revenue, El Paso runs the meters till 3 in the morning.
We've got some questions piling up, and one of them is about Austin. I'll get to that in a little while. But I did want to ask you, you mentioned equity. A criticism of paid parking sometimes is most people, the vast majority of people, are dependent on their cars to get from one place to another. In America today, many of those people have relatively low incomes. And so creating a price for parking it is sometimes argued puts an additional financial burden on those folks, and that is an inequitable outcome. I'm just kind of curious. I know you've heard that argument a million times. Just kind of wondering what your thought is about that.
Well, I have 3 or 4 answers to that. The first one is that many people who oppose paying for parking push poor people out in front of them like human shields, and don't charge for parking because it'll hurt poor people. Really, they don't want to pay for parking themselves, and it's an easy all-purpose objection to just about anything. I mean, why should you? Sales taxes do the same thing, and gasoline taxes do the same thing. That we don't say we should get rid of gasoline taxes because it hurts the poor who need to drive wherever they're going. somehow parking is something that they attack. And partly it's the status quo bias, is what we're used to. But that's not the important response that I would give. Another one is that many really poor people can't afford a car. So the problem with using free parking as the way to help the poor is quite misguided, because it misses the really poor people. The poor, it gives the poorest people nothing. A lot of the money goes to high income people. So the problem with free parking is that most of the people who get it are not poor, and many poor people don't get it. So that's a very bad way to be philanthropic. In San Francisco, it showed up when permit parking districts. It came out in the San Francisco Chronicle that Danielle Steele, the famous romance novelist, had 26 free parking permits for her house in her mansion in the Pacific Heights. So that suggests that free parking is not effective philanthropy. And then the third thing that I could say is that you can always give a discount on parking to low-income people, just as we give lifeline rates on electricity and natural gas. The city owns it, and they can give a discount to low-income people. But if they do, I think they should also give the same subsidy to people who are too poor to own a car. That unless you give the same amount of money to people who are too poor to own a car, you're again penalizing the poorest people. So I think that cities have a lot of opportunities to make it easier for low-income people. And then other cities, I think this would probably work in Houston. The specific argument is that people who work in the area and park on the street need this subsidy. So whenever I go to a restaurant, I always ask people, well, where did you park? And in most, if they're parking meters, they usually say, well, I try to get here around 5:30 before the meters stop, and then I pay 50 cents and I get the space all evening long. But that means the customers are not going to find any curb parking. The people who are paying them tips and who pay for the restaurant to be there, they don't find a parking space and they can go someplace else. So what some cities have done is to give off-street parking permits to low-income people. If you earn less than $15 an hour, for example, you get free parking in city-owned parking structures, or they even rent it in private parking structures. So instead of giving free curb parking to everybody in this futile attempt, this pathetic attempt to help poor people, you can really target poor people and say, well, we'll give you a discount, or we will give you free parking off street. And cities that do have public parking structures, that's an easy thing to do, especially for waiters in the evening, because the structures are half empty. So it doesn't cost the city anything. Your question?
Oh yeah, very much so. I think your argument is that there's equity arguments on the other side, and if you want to subsidize those who with modest incomes, then just do it in one way or another. Don't.
That is the real issue. I think that public services are by world standards not very good in the United States. We have what John Kenneth Galbraith called private affluence and public squalor. And I think that if public services aren't good, richer people have alternatives, that they can send their kids to private schools. They can join country clubs if the parks aren't good. The rich people have alternatives to public services, but poor people depend on public services. So I think that having poor public services is selectively harmful to low-income people. And this is a way to improve public services. That you can pay for daycare for the services in a neighborhood. if the concern of the neighborhood really is to help poor people, they can use the money to help poor people.
You know, thinking a little bit more broadly and philosophically about your approach to parking and thinking about it as it affects other issues, I well remember the required course you taught that I took at UCLA Planning School was called Public Resource Allocation. And one of the things I learned in parking was the best way to understand this is there's basically, if you have a resource that is available to the public and there is greater demand than supply, then you can allocate it one of three different ways. One is first come, first serve. The other is to reward tenure, or that's rewarding tenure. The second one is to put some kind of time limit on the use of the resource, and the third one is to charge for it. I'm curious, if you think more broadly as an economist, what are some of the other public resources that are out there that we must allocate as a society that could best be allocated through pricing as opposed to one of those other two mechanisms?
Well, the roads themselves. I mean, Houston is famous for building even ever wider highways in a way to reduce congestion. And that causes, it's immensely expensive and it doesn't work. Congestion pricing of the roads is, I think, far more important than getting the price of curb parking right. But it's a lot easier to charge a parked car than it is to charge a moving car. And I think that it's getting back to my Machiavellian approach to parking, is that with parking, you can show the gains from paying for parking. That a parking benefit turns the what seems like a pain for drivers into gains for the residents. And if the parkers or somebody you don't know, and you know that you will get better sidewalks and safer neighborhood as a result of charging for parking, then you will say, I'll do that. You can do it incrementally as well. Congestion pricing is harder. So it's harder to show the gains. Well, where does the money go? And you don't see these benefits staring you straight in the face. As soon as a merchant steps out their front door, they can see the benefits of the meters if the city returns the money. So I think that the roads, the moving traffic and the parked traffic are the two biggest ways that we should reform ourselves, and other countries are doing it. That London has congestion pricing, Stockholm has congestion pricing, Singapore, it does work, but it's politically much more difficult. The nice thing about parking, you can do it one block at a time. So in Houston, the downtown is sort of the market-based parking district is creeping outward, like into your neighborhood. It can creep outward, and if they had parking benefit districts, they could creep outward. Say, once one part of the city gets it, other parts of the city won't. Say in Pasadena, other parts of the city, other parking benefit districts have been formed. And in Houston, they started out on Washington Avenue, and now it's spreading.
Washington Avenue was the first parking benefit district, yes.
Well, that's right. It's bottom up rather than top down, and it's some of the most valuable land on earth. The curb parking is the land is so valuable, but it's given away free. As you pointed out, that was Tom Sowell said that what everybody wants adds up to more than there is. And when you have that, you have these three ways to allocate it that you talked about. And I think that it's so elementary that, say, for a bank, would a bank think it's a good idea to have free curb parking, and then every new building that they have to lend money for has to dig a garage 3 levels below ground in order to get permission? Well, your wonderful book, I think Bill has written many wonderful books, but the one I like best had a great description of parking. First, the city requires you to build the parking, and then it allows you to build something to finance it. That's how when you have parking requirements. We will never allow a new building unless it has plenty of off-street parking. We know better than you do how much parking you need.
Well, that raises I want to go to the audience questions now. We have a lot of them, and the first one or two, I'll combine the first two, but they are relevant to what you just said. So let me just kind of paraphrase the first two questions, which are related. One of our attendees says, developers often say they would happily provide less parking, but they can't get financing from the banks for their project unless they provide more than the code requires. So I'm curious about your thoughts about that. The second one is a comment from Vancouver. In fact, developers often build more than the required minimums. And presumably also, I mean, developers often blame the banks for that. Does that mean there should be regulated parking maximums as opposed to minimums? And then is it in fact true that banks and financiers do require more parking? And if so, what do you do about that?
Well, we also asked Julie about that, but I think that that's an all statement. When you actually talk to banks, either they say, well, no, we just want to make sure that you have all the required parking, so there will be never any problem with the title for the building. That nothing later on to say that there was something wrong with the permission for this building. The banks always look to make sure you meet the minimum parking requirement. And then if you, let's say it happens in some cities, in small cities in California, where they reduce the parking requirements, and people say this about banks, they say, well, we just go to San Francisco. They know how to lend money on buildings without parking, because San Francisco, without parking requirements. But it's foolish to think that no parking requirements mean no parking. Say when Buffalo removed all of its parking requirements, there were great hand-wringing about that there will be no parking. But Daniel Hess at the University of Buffalo looked at, I think, about 50 projects. In many of them, the developers provided more parking than was previously allowed, because that's what they thought their customers wanted. But some buildings, most buildings build less than was previously required, and a couple built no parking. These were affordable housing projects that could not have been built if they had had to provide the required parking. But on average, the supply parking decreased by about 70% overall, which is not a big change, but it means that if the third floor of underground parking would cost $75,000 a space, well, maybe you don't need that third floor of parking that was previously required. So I think that people blame banks for something, for following the city rules. Say San Francisco doesn't have any minimums, it has maximums. Do you think that nobody is willing to lend for a new building in San Francisco? I think that the smartest thing that cities could do is to leave all their parking requirement numbers the same and turn the minimums into maximums. Turn the
minimums into maximums.
If the minimum wasn't enough, we just want to make sure you don't provide more than enough, because we realize it adds to traffic congestion, air pollution, and now global warming. So I think the simplest and easiest thing to do, and some cities have done, Mexico City did it. They changed all their minimums into maximums with a clever new twist, that if you build more than half of the maximum, you have to pay a fee for every extra space above the half of the maximum. And they have parking benefit districts as well.
So instead of paying, say, an in lieu fee for not providing parking, you pay a fee for providing parking in Mexico.
Orlando does that as well. Orlando in Florida, they say if you go above the, I think, you have to pay for spaces.
There's a question here pointing out that Austin has like Houston has no minimum parking downtown, but still there's a lot of parking built. And there's very strong resistance to the idea, even in Austin, the People's Republic of Austin, of parking maximums. Do you have any recommendations for how politically to manage that, how to change the mindset so that maximums are viewed as okay. I mean, part of this is politics and part of this is a mindset, right?
Well, yes, but I think the maximums will probably be as arbitrary as the minimums because planners don't know what the right maximum it is. You know, they just have no way of explaining what is the right maximum. But I do think that changing the minimums into maximums is easier to explain. If the minimum was enough, we don't want you to provide more than enough because it leads to more traffic congestion, it leads to more air pollution, it leads to more impermeable surfaces, it leads to more, well, everything we say we don't want to happen.
You know, it's interesting in our last few KI forums, we've, even though we're based in Houston, we've been getting a lot of our questions have been from Vancouver. And so we are developing an audience in Vancouver, apparently. I'm not sure what Vancouver can learn from Houston, but here's a situation that one of our attendees from Vancouver laid out and is curious as to how you would respond to this. 1 month ago, the city council voted against citywide parking fees / permits. The mayor was the deciding vote. Paraphrasing his words, this plan is not equitable because a tradesperson would have to pay for parking on the street while an investment banker can park her Tesla in the backyard of their house. Just so this is again an equity question. Just kind of wondering what your thought is.
Well, I think if the money comes back to the neighborhood, that makes it a bit different. I think that what Vancouver, Canada, not Vancouver in Washington, but Vancouver has a very sensible idea for introducing a market-priced curb parking permits, you know, residential parking permits. That most cities here in LA, it's at $35 a year. What is that, 25 cents a day or something like that?
Right, right.
Vancouver, and there's a greater demand than there is supply. So what Vancouver wanted to raise the price of the permits to a market rate, so where demand equals supply. And they guessed at what it was, about $400 a year, which is only what was like I don't know, $20 or $30 a month. But they grandfathered everybody who's already there. Everybody who already lives there gets to keep paying the original $35 a month. But anybody who's new has to pay the market price, which they estimate about $400 and some a year. So nobody who's currently living there will pay anything extra. And of course, if the money comes back to the neighborhood, they'll get better public services. So I think this gradual introduction that anybody who moves in knows that this is the deal in the neighborhood, that if you can't live without a car, and you don't have the apartment doesn't have any parking off-street parking free for you, you can park on the street, but it'll cost you $20 or $30 a month. So I don't think that's very unfair. Especially, it isn't as though this Tesla owning banker at a single family house is living next to an apartment building. I think that cities are very segregated by income. And people who live in high income neighborhoods will be competing with each other for curb parking. And in low income neighborhoods, they'll be competing with low income people. So the prices will be much lower. No, in any case, I think you can't say because a few people are hurt, we won't think of that anymore. I mean, that sort of shuts down an argument when you say, well, people, they need the parking and they don't have that much money. It's as though I'm supposed to say, well, you're right, I should stop talking. No, it's not. It doesn't stop me from saying this, but they do sort of signal that this is not an acceptable policy, because I could point to somebody in general, hypothetically, who would be hurt. And of course, and low-income people are the ones who suffer most from air pollution in cars. You always ask, well, who is hurt by all the air pollution from cars? Well, people who are near roads and highways and things like that. Especially young people, children, they suffer, and old people. Yeah, disabled people suffer most from all the air pollution caused by cars. And so I think if we reduce the number of amount of driving, not drastically, but reduce it somewhat, I think it's foolish to say this is going to hurt low-income people. Foolish and contemptible. So
there's a couple of questions here about shared parking. I'm going to take these in reverse order in order to introduce the topic. One attendee says, where is there a good example of implementing a program requiring developers to pay into a centralized fund via which the municipality then provides well-located shared parking for all businesses? And how is this transition to public shared parking best managed over time in a commercial corridor that is primarily served by privately controlled parking lots?
Well, I suppose sometimes in lieu fees are said to do that. Instead of providing the required parking for a building, you could pay an in lieu fee that goes to build public parking. But I think that's another way to subsidize parking. The builder, has to pay for this shared parking. I think
rather than building parking that's backed by tax revenue, by parking fee revenue, I mean.
Well, I have a different proposal that gets back. I should be more respectful to the people who worry about poor people. I just finished a paper talking about the parking benefit districts in Manhattan on the Upper West Side. Everybody knows about the Upper West Side, especially if they watch Seinfeld. And Seinfeld had a lot of issues about parking, and
there's a lot of parking jokes in Seinfeld, right?
George Costanza said once, paying for parking is like going to a prostitute. Why should I pay if, when I apply myself, maybe I can get it for free? Well, that's why he said it in the Upper West Side, because it is free. Now, I made the proposal to charge the market price for parking. If you look at the off-street parking price, it was about, I can't remember how much, $24 a day or something like that.
On the Upper West Side.
On the Upper West Side. So if you charge that price for on-street parking, it would yield something like $250 million a year for added public services. And I think that if you had to pay to store your car on the street, and George Costanza had to pay $24 a day, he probably wouldn't do it. But what could happen is that the shared cars, like zip cars, they could pay for a curb parking space. And if you had a street, like a typical street with 20 curb parking spaces, that I can imagine, and 400 people, that's the average ratio in the Upper West Side, is 400 people to 20 parking spaces. I think if the zip car was outbid the private property owners, the private car owners for a curb space, and converted all of those curb spaces to shared car spaces, that would be a lot better for the 400 people who occasionally want a car, but they can't afford one. That poor people, sometimes they have urgency, they need a car. And I think if you lived on a street where all the curb parking spaces were filled with zip cars, that you would be a lot better off than for the 400 people whose curb spaces were filled with 20 privately owned cars. So I think the denser the area, the more you can find sharing cars. I'm not talking about sharing parking. I'm talking about sharing the cars. Of course, that shares the parking as well.
I can remember when I was planning director of San Diego, our informal arrangement with one of the rideshare companies was simply that they would pay all the parking tickets we gave them, and they thought that was a perfectly fine deal for them economically. Um, uh, there was another question on shared parking. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. One of our attendees asked whether you had any thoughts on the reliability of the ULI shared parking factor. ULI has devised some shared parking ratios.
Well, I think that they're more sensible than the parking requirements themselves, but they're usually designed to meet a parking requirement with shared parking rather than individually parking on the side of the building itself. I think it's a very complicated formula but I think it makes a lot of sense if you're going to share parking between a bank and a nightclub. So
right.
Well, and San Diego has a very good policy that I don't think has spread as far as it should. That the property owners convert their parking lot, say for a Walgreens, which has to have a big parking lot. They put in parking meters, and it becomes a public parking lot. Anybody can pay to park there. If you shop at Walgreens, you're validated. So the street parking to its customers, but they make it available to everybody else. And many banks do that in the daytime, that it is bank parking only. And the evening, the parking station is there, and in the evening it's used for public parking. So I think whenever you see an empty parking lot in a business, I think that ought to be a shared park. And there's a company that is spreading around, especially Maine. When I was on a trip to speak in Maine, I saw this company moves in. It's a private operating company. It goes to every owner of a big parking lot and says, I'll convert this for you into public parking, and I'll share the revenue with you. And the non-customers will pay the regular price for parking that we charge. We put in the pay stations and police it. And I went to a historic library, and they had a lot, just for some legacy reason, they had a big parking lot, and they had signed up with this clever parking operator, and the library gets $6,000 a month from sharing its parking lot with non-users of the library. And the people who work at the library get free parking. The people who go to the library get free parking, but it's open to everybody else. And that's spread around Portland, and people were very surprised to find private these private parking lots turning into public parking lots.
I can remember the first time I talked to you about this, and I said, but people, private businesses value their parking so much they would never surrender any control of it. And your response was, as an economist, your response was, you'd be surprised what people are willing to do if you offer them money.
Yeah.
And I can remember shortly after I arrived at the Kinder Institute, we did a parking utilization study with Patrick Sigmund's assistance for Rice Village, right next to the Rice University. And there was a lot of clamor at the time for either the city or Rice to build an additional parking garage. And we concluded that there was, within a quarter mile of ground zero in Rice Village at any given time, 1,000 empty parking spaces. And so it was demand, it was management of supply more than it was creation of additional supply. And in fact, Rice has contracted with a couple of the owners of the private lots and garages to store the valet cars in those locations. So it was a minor step in that direction. Another question, you'll recall, Don, that Chicago privatized its parking meters. Some years ago, I think Mayor Richie Daley did that. So this question is, what advice would you have for cities that have privatized their parking meters but still want to make innovative use of street and curb space? Do they have any options?
Well, don't do what Chicago did. Almost the same year that Chicago sold the parking meter revenue for 75 years, San Francisco began SF Park to charge variable prices for parking. And the Chicago parking meter contract is very complicated. The city restricted the increase in parking rates to the consumer price index, which did nothing but drive down the amount of money the city got. And they lost control of the curb parking entirely. So I mean, it's like, and the $1.3 billion they got disappeared in a couple of years. It's like burning all the furniture on a cold night to stay warm. The cities tend to do this. They will sell off assets to pay current deficits. So I think that it's better to manage the city parking than to sell it to somebody who they think would manage it.
Jake Wigman, who, as you know, teaches planning at UT, had asked the question, what is your favorite example of a pro-Shoupista reform to date? I think you'd answered that question. We got another question, Jake, put it in the Q&A. But the next question is, how would a Shoupista approach mediating the tension when parking requirement reductions are strongly opposed by residential neighborhoods? What is a proper give and take that can assuage neighbors and help cities reduce the car cost subsidy other than avoiding the reform in neighborhoods altogether? How, when you run into neighborhoods that are opposed to reduction of parking requirements, how do you manage that tension?
We'll have permit parking districts. Many single-family neighborhoods near businesses don't like the idea of spillover parking. But I think that getting back to your idea of giving money, that I think the smart thing to do is that Laura Mattern, who is a parking consultant in Austin, did a wonderful program for Columbus, Ohio. Is that they began charging market prices for curb parking in the business area, but they they also established permit parking districts in the adjacent residential areas. And when there's excess parking available on the blocks where there's excess parking available, they allow the businesses to buy permits for their employees. Usually no more than 4 non-resident permits on a block. So and that money goes to pay for added public services in the permit district. So I think permit parking with non-resident buy-in. They also allow hourly parking in the permit parking district if there's space available. You can pay. They don't have meters, so you can pay by cell phone. But I think turning it into this valuable land into a money-earning asset is usually the way to improve a parking situation. But even if you didn't go that far, just have your conventional parking permit district will keep outsiders out.
We have a question here from Steve Spillett, another California-trained urban planner here in Houston, who says, has there been much research on the effect that excessive parking provisions have on economic productivity? Do they decline? Does the density of accessible property value or the amount of taxable sales in a given area decline, for example?
I don't know. I haven't seen that done, but if you just look around you see, well, do you think Manhattan has higher property values and more business than Phoenix?
Probably, yeah.
I don't think a low density area with plenty of parking. Oh yes, who is the fellow he's in North Carolina. He looks at the fiscal productivity of land uses, and the higher density with low parking requirement land uses produce far more property taxes than a Walmart will, which is has a huge parking lot. So, I think it's sort of, once you hear him talk, it seems intuitively obvious that areas with less parking and more housing generate more construction, higher land values, higher housing, well, more housing, I suppose, because instead of housing, you could have parking. And of course, the parking isn't worth much. It doesn't pay much in property taxes. It just takes up space. But getting back to your idea that the city will says you have to build parking and then we'll let you build something. Then I think if we let you build something without telling you how much parking you have to provide, how can that not be more productive and more profitable?
One question, which I think is worth addressing, is does just having less parking actually lead to less air pollution and the other benefits you suggest without building transit alternatives?
Oh, I think so, definitely. It means that people will be doing more carpooling. Now we can work from home. I'm working from home, and I imagine some of you are too in the Zoom session. And we don't require public transit for this. The electric bicycles are now an option. Uber and Lyft and Bird. I mean, there's so many alternatives to solo driving that you can't say that we don't have good public transit, therefore we can't let go of our parking requirements. That I think that the developers won't be eager to build a lot of housing without any parking if there's no public transit. So I think public transit gives an excellent excuse to get rid of minimum parking requirements. I think it's a terrible idea to have a public transit system and have minimum parking requirements right at the stations like LA does.
We have time for maybe one more question. There was a question, where does the Rice Village now has parking meters? Where does that money go? That's not just for clarification, that is not a public parking benefit district. Those are on Rice Management Company's private property to manage the parking, to encourage people to use the parking garage on the Rice property, not on the commercial property owned by Rice. Alan McCoy, why don't you send me an email and I'll send that to Don. We can discuss that. Last question. Any progress in factoring environmental costs for parking? Free parking directly undermines public transit and results in damaging impacts that excessive surface paving has on flooding, biodiversity, et cetera, heat islands. None of these environmental costs are really factored into parking costs. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, yes. I would say that cities, when they set parking requirements, all they look at is ratios in other cities. They just look at the amount of parking spaces needed. They don't look at any of these other factors. It's just demand for parking. The supposed demand for parking. No, I think that minimum parking requirements, as I said, I think are an epic mistake, that planners have meddled in something that they've only made worse. But it isn't as though the planners being dictatorial. They're responding to what people want. Everybody wants free parking, including me. But that doesn't mean to be a principle of urban planning and transportation planning.
Okay. All right. Well, Don, thanks very much for this very stimulating conversation we had. We didn't get to all the questions. We will capture the questions, pass them on to Don, and hopefully he will be able to answer them in the future. It's been great to have you here. Thanks again to PNC for being our title sponsor for this series. On December 14th, and I think we're going to put this on the screen now, on December 14th, our education research arm, Houston Education Research Consortium, will share results from the survey on social and emotional skills. A panel discussion will follow. And then next year on February 17th, Rachel Kimbrough, the Dean of Social Sciences at Rice, will discuss her new book, In Too Deep, Class and Mothering in a Flooded Community, some really powerful work she did in the wake of Hurricane Harvey here in Houston. You can register for these upcoming events by visiting kinder.rice.edu, or I believe, yes, there's a QR code on the screen right now. You can just scan that. So thanks very much for being with us. This concludes all of our programs for this calendar year, with the exception of the HERC event in a couple of weeks. Again, thank you, Don. Thank you, PNC, and we'll see you all soon.